in which we look at the large intestine and its anatomy and histology and physiology, or in other words, its functions. Okay, so let's take a look at the large intestine. Here we go, the very last part of the GI tract. Okay, so the large intestine is about 1.5 meters in length, so that's, all of the large intestine is as long as the jejunum of the small intestine. So it's divided into 4 major regions, but so in some of those are subdivided. So let's go ahead and just go through all of these parts. So it starts here at the ileocecal valve. So the ileocecal valve is the valve or the sphincter between the ileum and the cecum. So the cecum is the first part of the large intestine. And so the cecum, why is it doing that? Okay. The cecum is, has some ability to distend, to fill, because when chyme comes from the ileum into the large intestine, it is liquid at that point. By the time it passes all the way through the large intestine, ideally it's solid, or it's not chyme anymore by that point, it's now feces. So in the large intestine, that's where that transition is happening. But anyway, the point is liquid when it arrives. And so the cecum is this place that can kind of fill and receive, a fair amount of that liquid all at once, and then send it on against gravity upwards through the ascending colon. So there are a number of parts of the colon, which is one of the parts of the large intestine. So the colon has an ascending colon that goes up, from the cecum upward toward, like in the direction of the liver. So this is on the the right side of the body. And then there's a corner at the liver, and that corner is called the hepatic flexure. So meaning that's the corner by the liver. And then it turns into the transverse colon, so that goes across the abdomen, kind of up by the stomach, a little below it. So that's going from right to left across the stomach, across the abdomen. And then there's another corner, so that's the splenic flexure, so that's the corner by the spleen. And then it turns into the descending colon, and so that's going down the left side of the body. And then we get the sigmoid colon. So the sigmoid colon heads posteriorly and medially from the descending colon. And then the very last part is the rectum. So the rectum, the last couple of inches of the rectum are the anal canal. And so the very last sphincter of the whole GI tract is the anus. And there's an inner and outer anal sphincter. If we go back to the cecum, there's another feature, or another organ that kind of hangs off of the large intestine, and it's called the appendix, which we can see on this diagram. It's sometimes called a vermiform appendix, or sometimes just the appendix. And so let's just take a moment to talk about the appendix before we go into the rest of the large intestine. So the appendix, what is that guy? So maybe some of you have had your appendix removed, and maybe none of you have, and that'd be great if you still have your appendix. But sometimes, like one of the things we learn when we learn an abdominal exam is we learn how to assess for an inflamed or a infected appendix, right? And so what can happen with the appendix is it can become infected, in other words, filled with what we might call, from the perspective of the digestive system, an overgrowth of opportunistic flora. And it can do that to the extent that it can burst. The appendix, what does it do? So lots of people think that what the appendix is for is to store flora. So, there are times when the flora of the large intestine and the small intestine get completely wiped out. Like if you have like a stomach flu kind of thing, or food poisoning, or, something like that, but stomach flu is a good example where there's fever, there's like a systemic illness happening, there's vomiting, there's diarrhea. Something like that kills a whole lot of the flora in the large intestine and in the small intestine. And we don't want to have to start over from scratch every time we get our our flora all wiped out. So we have this little sort of seed pouch that we carry around attached to our large intestine called the appendix, and it contains strands of lots of different flora that occupy the large intestine and the small intestine, and it's situated right there where the small intestine and the large intestine meet. So should the flora get wiped out, or should we need to replace or kind of boost some strands of flora, of bacteria or virus or fungus or whatever, it can come out of the appendix, and then it can travel into the large intestine or into the small intestine, because the transition is right there, and then the flora can repopulate those areas. So since the flora plays such very, very important roles for the digestive system, and actually for, systemically throughout the entire body, it's important that we have a little spare pouch there of flora. So that's what the appendix is all about. And one of the things about the flora, is it takes us a good solid year from birth to fully populate our entire digestive system with all of the flora that we need, because some strains grow really slowly, and some grow quickly, and some feed on different things and things like that. So we don't want it to have to take a year every time we have to be on antibiotics and we kill all of our flora or whatever. So anyway, that's what the appendix is about. And okay, so let's go on and look at the large intestine. One of the features we see here on the large intestine is the sort of like these kind of bumps all along the way that we didn't see in any other part of the digestive system. These bumps are called haustrum. Let's see, haustrum I guess is one, and haustra is plural. And these are sort of divisions of the large intestine, where fecal matter can kind of hang out there a little bit, get some fluids absorbed from it, and then the haustrum can contract and push it along. Another feature we see here, let's see where, I'm trying to see where it's labeled on, is the Tania coli, which is this, here's where it's labeled there. It's this sort of fibrous tissue that runs along the large intestine and just kind of keeps it intact and all sort of a similar size and muscular tension and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's look at the what else do we need to look at here? Okay, I'm looking in the notes at the anatomy of the large intestine. It looks like I talked about most of it already. Let's just talk about the rectum and the anus a little bit more here. So the rectum is the last part of the large intestine. It lies just anterior to the sacrum and coccyx. And feces are stored in the rectum until a bowel movement. So part of what stimulates a bowel movement, or stimulates the awareness of the need to have a bowel movement, is stress receptors in the rectum. So once the rectum fills, we have that awareness of there being fecal matter there, and that, so we're like, hey, at the next rest stop, we should pull over or whatever. So you're ready for a bowel movement once there's feces in the rectum because of those stress receptors. But you can hold feces in there for quite some time, thanks to the fact that if we look at the last part of the rectum, and it's hard to really see any distinction on this diagram, but the last couple of inches are the anal canal, or not a couple of inches, the last couple of centimeters are the anal canal, which has two sphincters. So the inner sphincter is smooth muscle, the outer sphincter is skeletal muscle. So remember, all the way back at the beginning of the GI tract, we had skeletal muscle making up the muscularis. So in the mouth, in the in the pharynx, in the esophagus, in the top part of the esophagus, we had skeletal muscle. In the esophagus, it transitions. So the middle third of the esophagus is half skeletal muscle, half smooth muscle. The lower third of the esophagus is all smooth muscle. And then from there on out, until we get all the way down to the outer anal sphincter, we have smooth muscle. So smooth muscle, of course, we have involuntary control over, meaning that we don't have to consciously be telling our stomach to do the churning it does, or we don't have to consciously tell the small intestine to do segmentation, which is nice. It just happens on its own. But it's also nice that we have skeletal muscle as the outer anal sphincter because we do have voluntary control over that. So we can hold feces in the rectum until we voluntarily open that outer anal sphincter. The inner anal sphincter is smooth muscle, and it will automatically open when we open the outer anal sphincter. And that's part of gaining control of one's bowels when we're, a baby in diapers and transitioning out of diapers. Part of what we're learning is that voluntary control over the outer anal sphincter. And once we have it, we don't have to be in diapers anymore, at least for poop. Okay, moving on. Let's look at the 4 layers of the large intestine. So, same 4 layers. So the innermost layer is the mucosa. But if you look at this mucosa, it looks significantly different than the mucosa of the small intestine. So remember how in the small intestine, we had these finger-like projections sticking into the lumen, creating as very much surface area as we possibly could. And with the large intestine, it's almost like we have like inverted villi in a sense, right? Like it's not exactly that, but we have these pockets that drop down away from the surface rather than these fingers sticking up into the lumen. And then the blood capillaries and lymph capillaries that are there are in between those pockets that kind of drop down into the lamina propria. But basically we're going to see epithelial cells that have goblet cells, or the epithelial layer, and some of those cells are going to be goblet cells, and some of those cells are absorptive cells. So that tells us there is some absorption that's happening in the large intestine. And what absorption is happening here is water, and it's ions, and it's vitamins. I'm just noticing in the notes it says the absorptive cells which absorb water, ions, and vitamins, and just like that, that's all. Okay, but anyway, maybe it was going to say minerals. I don't know. It's a question. Anyway, it says water, ions, and vitamins. And that is for real. Those 3 things are definitely getting absorbed in the large intestine. But here's a question. We looked at the small intestine, and we noticed that inside every villus there was a capillary bed, and that capillary bed was receiving our water-soluble nutrients. And we also found inside every villus was a lymph lacteal, or a lymph capillary, and that was receiving the fatty nutrients. So if we are not doing major absorption of nutrients like cholesterol and fatty acids and glycerol and phospholipids and all of these fats that we've broken down in the digestive system, if we're not absorbing them in the large intestine, why do we need to have a lymph lacteal in the large intestine? What would it be there for? Well, okay, for a couple of reasons. One is lymph doesn't just absorb nutrients in the small intestine. It also absorbs fluids. So like anytime there's edema in fluids, or just the normal interstitial fluid, constantly some of our interstitial fluid is going into the lymph system to be filtered and cleaned, and any bacteria or whatever killed that might be in it. But also there's a tiny bit of something kind of fatty being absorbed in the large intestine, and that is vitamin K. So vitamin K is one of our fat-soluble vitamins, and so as a fat-soluble vitamin, we need to absorb it into the lymph, unlike the rest of the, unlike ions and stuff that would be going into the blood as water-soluble nutrients. Okay, so what else is happening here? So we have absorptive cells, we have goblet cells, and let's see, the cells, and we talked, okay, so the cells, so I talked about these sort of pockets that dip in kind of away from the surface. Those create what are called intestinal glands. Those are the glands of the large intestine. And so, but basically there, we have goblet cells and absorptive cells in there. Lamina propria, nothing major to write home about. Submucosa, let's see, anything different here? No, nothing to write home about. With the submucosa, the muscularis, same, the only difference about the muscular, same as pretty much the rest of the GI tract. It's just that Taenia coli, which we have here, which contract to help to form the haustra of the large intestine. And then the serosa that's associated with the large intestine is called the mesocolon, and it attaches the large intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. So let's look at the functions of the large intestine. So 5 functions, just like we had for the small intestine. And so we're going to see some movement. We're going to see some breakdown, even though there are not enzymes being produced here. We're going to see vitamin production as a function, absorption, and defecation. So let's take a look here. So our first, this does not look super clear, does it? But here it is. This is our first movement that we're looking at of the large intestine. And what this is the gastroileal reflex. So what happens here is after a meal, so once the stomach kind of fills up, the gastroileal reflex is initiated in the stomach, which moves chyme along the GI tract to prepare each organ to receive substances from the previous organ. So this is the signal being, it's a signal, but it's a physical thing that happens, being sent along the GI tract. When there's food in the stomach, like this message gets sent along the GI tract that says, hey, a new meal is coming, new food's coming, so whatever's in the small intestine, clear it out into the large intestine. Large intestine, whatever you've been working on, moving on out from there. So, so what we're seeing here is the ileocecal valve opens as part of that gastroileal reflex. So, a new meal arrives in the stomach, and that stimulates the small intestine to kind of move things along and clear out. And part of that process then is the ileocecal valve opening and the contents of the small intestine emptying into the cecum so that we can make way for the new food that's coming in. So that's the gastroileal reflex that shows up in the large intestine. Let's see here. Peristalsis, of course, happens throughout the large intestine, but there's a specific type of peristalsis called mass peristalsis. The mass peristalsis that happens is in response to the gastroileal reflex, and I don't think I have a diagram of it, do I? Sort of, yeah, sort of here. So this is a Netter diagram. If you don't have a Frank Netter anatomy book on your shelf, if you're ever at Bookman's or something like that and you find one, it's totally worth picking up. Frank Netter did fantastic art of all. He was a physician and also an artist, and he has fantastic drawings of every possible aspect of the body. Here is the large intestine and what's happening here. So this is partly showing us the gastroileal reflex. So we can see the ileocecal valve opening up, the contents from the large intestine filling the cecum. And so small intestine is emptying, large intestine is filling. But part of what happens here is the peristalsis throughout the GI tract is stimulated, but we get a really strong peristalsis here in the middle of the transverse colon. And that's called mass peristalsis. So, so that is basically going to move fecal matter along. So you can also see here going up the ascending colon, a strong peristalsis. But this is mass peristalsis happening in the middle of the transverse colon, moving fecal matter along. And the idea then is the same thing, like let's move out the feces that we have because we're preparing for more substances coming in from the small intestine. So that also means that whatever was in the sigmoid colon gets moved into the rectum. And then again, that stretch in the rectum is part of what stimulates the, and this is a much better diagram actually, where we couldn't see it in the other one, where we can see the anal sphincters, not so much the sphincters, but the anal canal. So the rectum then will fill, and then we can hold feces in the rectum, more or less as long as we need to until we decide it's time for a bowel movement. Okay. So what else? Haustral churning is something else that happens in the large intestine. Haustral churning is simply the contraction of the smooth muscle of one haustrum that moves fecal matter along to the next haustrum, and it kind of happens sort of segment by segment like that, or haustrum by haustrum. And then peristalsis is the other movement that happens in the GI tract, which happens happens in the large intestine, but it happens throughout the GI tract. Breakdown. What's happening for breakdown in the large intestine? So no enzymes are produced by the large intestine, so we do not have enzymatic activity happening there because it has all happened in the small intestine. Whatever did not get absorbed in the small intestine, other than water and ions and vitamins, tough luck. It's leaving the body in the feces, which means yes, there is definitely under an undigested food in the feces, there's definitely lost potential nutrients in the feces because there's no 100% efficient system, and plenty of stuff goes not fully digested. So whatever is not fully digested when it arrives in the large intestine, it's not getting digested by enzymes and absorbed anymore by that point. But there is some breakdown that happens. So I had mentioned before that there's plenty of specific flora that's housed in the large intestine, and so the flora that's housed there will feed on the undigested material that's in the fecal matter, and the action of those of that flora, since a lot of it is bacteria, what happens when a bacteria feeds is it lets off gases. And so when bacteria are feeding on carbohydrates, essentially what that means is those carbohydrates are fermenting. And that releases hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane gases, which can contribute to flatulence. And not just flatulence, but also painful gas and bloating that some people experience. Amino acids break down into simpler substances, meaning basically like that the amino group comes off. So different bacteria can feed on different aspects of amino acids, but we might see that amino group come off and something might feed on it, or it just might turn into ammonia and need to be eliminated from the body. What else? Let's see. So some stuff is going to end up back in the liver and then eliminated. Some of the stuff that might be toxic might end up back in the liver and then detoxified and made safe to put into the blood, and then either the kidneys will eliminate if there are toxins and things like that being absorbed in the large intestine, and or maybe it will go into the bile and take another trip through and potentially be eliminated that way. Bilirubin is also broken down in the large intestine. So bilirubin, remember, is the byproduct of breaking down hemoglobin, and the liver did that and put that bilirubin into bile. So that bile then entered the GI tract in the duodenum when the gallbladder released bile that goes into the duodenum. So now the bile has been mixed in with the digesting food this whole way, and it's still there, and it will be eliminated from the body through the large intestine. But the bilirubin that's in there will get broken down a little bit more too. So that's the breakdown that's happening in the large intestine. The building of stuff that's happening in the large intestine is vitamins. So we don't have all of that flora in there for no reason. We have that flora in there for very good reason, and many good reasons. Like there are great studies done on gut flora and emotions, and so we find that people who suffer from depression have similar gut flora to each other, and if we can switch that gut flora out and give them different flora, it completely takes care of their depression. So it's way beyond you are what you eat. It's more like what you eat also feeds your flora, and your flora, there are way more of them than there are of us. There's like about 100 cells of bacteria, etc., that make up our flora per one of our cells. So there are many, many more of them than there are of our own cells in the GI tract. And so however they're feeling, yeah, we're going to feel that way. And whatever they want to eat, we're going to have a desire to eat that. We want to feed them. They talk very clearly and directly and specifically to us. Anyway, I'm digressing, as I often do. Okay, so we're looking at the function of the large intestine, that is vitamin production. So there are a few vitamins that are definitely produced by the large intestine. Those are vitamin K, biotin, which is B7, and pantothenic acid, which is B5. So, and there are other B vitamins as well. So I think of the large intestine. So vitamin K, that's one of our fat-soluble vitamins, and that's important in blood clotting. So if you've ever given birth at a hospital, or been around when a baby is born in the hospital, one of the things they do there is give them a shot of vitamin K, because a whole lot of our vitamin K, yes, comes from the food that we're eating, but if we haven't eaten anything yet. We don't have any food in our systems, but also our vitamin K comes from the flora in our large intestine. And when we're born, our GI tract is sterile. We don't have any flora in there at all. We start growing it right away after birth, though. That birth experience gives us our first dose of flora. And so we start producing vitamin K, once we start to have that flora populating the large intestine. But until then, should we need to blood clot, before we're really producing significant amounts of vitamin K, that's why they give a vitamin K shot very often to babies in the hospital. Okay, so vitamin K is a vitamin that's produced by the flora of the large intestine, and B vitamins. So not all of the B vitamins, but more than just biotin and pantothenic acid. B12 is likely produced there, and potentially other B vitamins. And so the very, very cool thing about that is that B vitamins are something, they are water-soluble vitamins, and they're vitamins that we need to have on board all of the time because they function, a whole lot of them function in ATP production. And so if we don't have B vitamins, that limits, or if we don't have a certain B vitamin, that limits our ability to make ATP. So even if we're fasting, so we're not actively taking in food, we still need to have our B vitamins. But being water-soluble vitamins, we can't store them. Our fat-soluble vitamins, our liver can store them for us, so we don't have to eat them and take them in every day. But B vitamins, in theory, we need to take them in every day. But what if we're not eating every day? Not to worry. We have little B vitamin factories in our large intestine. How cool is that? So we can be fasting, but still producing vitamin B, the whole, many of the B vitamins, so that we can still be making ATP even while we're not actively eating. So anyway, so we carry around a little B vitamin factory and vitamin K factory in our large intestine. So vitamin production is an important function of the large intestine. And then our last two functions are absorption and defecation. So what gets absorbed in the large intestine? That would be water and ions. So here it's listed as salts, but that's ions. And vitamins. So the vitamins that are being produced here, those are the vitamins that are being absorbed in the large intestine, from the large intestine into the bloodstream. And then our last function of the large intestine is defecation or elimination. So whatever we didn't digest, all the leftover matter, which, basically feces are made up of dead cells that got sloughed off along the way, undigested food, and some of the undigested food was going to be undigested regardless of how long it stayed in there, because plenty of our undigested food is fiber, and we don't break down fiber, and that's part of what gives bulk to the feces. So there's fiber, there's sloughed off cells, there is undigested food, so there's stuff that we just didn't get to as far as digesting it. There's bacteria, so those flora, like the transitional flora that never meant to take up residence inside our body, but also, flora that do live there, but, on this particular bowel movement are taking the ride on out with some feces. So we definitely have bacteria in there too, and other things that make up our flora. And so then that's our, and plus other waste products. So like, bile, we know is a secretion. So it has, a function in the digestive system, but is also a place for us to put waste products and send them out of the body. So, so we have all sorts of wastes and things in the feces. Okay, let's see what else we need to talk about here with the large intestine. Sorry, my computer is glitching at the moment. Let's try this. Okay, phases of digestion, I guess, is the next thing. So the phases of digestion, there are 3 phases. So basically what this is talking about is, I guess it's clear, phases. That's like the different steps of digestion, but essentially the neural control and the hormonal control of those things. So the first phase of digestion is called the cephalic phase. So cephalic refers to head. So the cephalic phase happens when we think about food, or when we smell food, or when, perhaps when the hypothalamus tells us we're hungry because we're a little dehydrated, or because our blood sugar is low, or because our leptin levels are low, or whatever, that hypothalamus input or smelling food as you're driving by someplace or whatever. Any of those things can stimulate the cephalic phase. So the cephalic phase is the beginning of digestion. Seeing, smelling, tasting, touching food stimulate, or thinking about food, all of those things stimulate the cephalic phase, which basically stimulates the stomach and says, hey, stomach, get ready because some food's coming before too long. So then once we eat, that takes us into the gastric phase. And so we don't have to eat if we're in the cephalic phase. You can smell food and think about food and whatever and not end up eating, and that'll be okay. We like to eat though, so if we're in the cephalic phase, it feels very satisfying to then move into the gastric phase. So we eat, let's say, and we put food in the stomach, and that starts the gastric phase. So the stretch of the stomach wall says to the body, hey, there's food in the stomach, and that's that starts feedback communication within the nervous system about what's happening here. So so basically, while there's digestion happening in the stomach, that will be the stomach stuff will be enhanced, and we'll also be giving a heads up to the intestines that, hey, digestion of food is coming along, get ready. So like the pancreas and the gallbladder and the small intestine can all get ready to do their thing as food comes their way. And then the third phase of digestion is the intestinal phase. So as the stomach empties and the duodenum fills, that's the transition between the gastric phase and the intestinal phase. So of course these phases overlap. They're not super distinct. Will be partly in the gastric phase and partly in the intestinal phase. But basically what happens is as the stomach empties, then we get signals that says, okay, stomach, thanks, got it, you can start to chill out now. So both hormonal and neural signals that tell the stomach it's done a good job, and food is now passing into the intestines, and in the intestinal part of digestion is picking up. So it will tell the stomach to chill out, and it will tell the intestines and the gallbladder and the pancreas to pick up their functions and do their thing. And so basically, though, we're in the intestinal phase for the rest of that, as the food goes all the way through the small intestine. And then once we start a new phase, like at the next meal, and we go into the gastric phase again by putting food into the stomach, then that's going to shift that gears and do that gastroileal reflex that we saw, which is going to empty out the small intestine, put the chyme or the digested food into the large intestine, and then the large intestine, takes over its stuff from there. So it's kind of the gastric phase does kind of stimulate the large intestine as well, because from the previous meal. Okay, that's the phases of digestion. Let's go over the hormones that regulate digestion. Hopefully we're doing okay on time here. And okay, so we're just going to look at 3 hormones here that regulate digestion. And we've seen these already, and there are more hormones, but these are 3 that do a lot of that regulation, and these are hormones that do play into the phases of digestion that we were just looking at. So this is a chart on the bottom of on page 13 in your notes, and this chart just goes row by row on the slides here. So the first hormone is gastrin. Remember gastrin? We talked about that guy way back when, because it's produced by the G cells in the gastric pits of the mucosa of the stomach. So gastrin is the hormone that's produced in the stomach. It's stimulated by distension of the stomach. That means the presence of food in the stomach stimulates the release of gastrin. Also, chemically, the presence of partially digested proteins or the presence of caffeine or a high pH, which means that a high pH would mean that that hydrochloric acid is not being produced. Any of those things will chemically or physically stimulate the gastrin, the G cells to stimulate gastrin. Once gastrin is in the bloodstream, is going to come right back around and stimulate the stomach cells and stimulate other things as well. So what are the functions of gastrin? Gastrin promotes secretion of gastric juice. So the presence of this hormone enhances the gastric phase of digestion. It enhances everything the stomach is, it's made to do. So it increases gastric motility, and promotes the secretion of gastric juice. It promotes the growth of gastric mucosa. So of course we do have to replace that gastric mucosa fairly frequently. Gastrin stimulates the growth of the gastric mucosa. It constricts the lower esophageal sphincter. So the idea is that once gastrin is released into the bloodstream and is having an effect on cells, we now are starting to get active in what the stomach is doing, and now we don't want that stomach acid to splash up into the esophagus, and so this is going to give us a good strong contraction on the lower esophageal sphincter to keep that lower acidic, the lower acidic contents, or the lower pH contents, I should say, of the stomach in the stomach. Gastrin also relaxes the pyloric sphincter, so as things get digested enough to leave the stomach and move on to the small intestine, that pyloric sphincter will start to relax so that we can move things on to the small intestine. And it also relaxes the ileocecal valve, because this is that connection between the stomach and the large intestine, that if food is in the stomach, then that means the small intestine needs to empty to get ready to receive the food that's in the stomach, so it's going to relax the ileocecal valve to empty out the small intestine and fill up the large intestine. So that is gastrin. Let's look at our next one, secretin. So secretin is produced by what are called the S cells of the mucosa of the duodenum. So these are those enteroendocrine cells that we looked at the small intestine. And what stimulates these guys? It's acidic chyme entering the duodenum. So it's more of a chemical stimulation. So they notice the drop in pH when the acidic contents of the stomach shows up in the small intestine, and that stimulates those enteroendocrine cells to produce secretin. Secretin, what does it do? We've looked at it before, but let's just look at it again. It stimulates the secretion of pancreatic juice and bile. Great, totally perfect, makes sense. There's food in the small intestine that says, and that's going to stimulate a hormone that's going to stimulate pancreatic juice and bile to be secreted. It inhibits the secretion of gastric juice, so basically this hormone is part of that control between beginning to shut off the gastric phase of digestion and initiate the intestinal phase of digestion. It promotes normal growth of the pancreas, just like gastrin promoted normal growth of the stomach mucosa. And secretin also enhances the effects of CCK. So CCK is a good friend of secretin, and let's take a look at what CCK does. So cholecystokinin is CCK. It is also made by those enteroendocrine cells of the small intestine. Same cells, same place as secretin. What stimulates it? Partially digested proteins showing up from the stomach, partially digested triglycerides, and the presence of fatty acids. All of these, so again, more of a chemical stimulation of these partially digested foods showing up from the stomach. That's what stimulates these cells to produce CCK. This is a hormone, goes into the bloodstream. What does it do? What cells does it act on? It's going to show up at the pancreas and stimulate the release of pancreatic juice. It's going to stimulate the release of bile from the gallbladder. It's going to stimulate the relaxation of the hepatopancreatic ampulla, so that the pancreatic juice from the pancreas, the bile from the gallbladder can both empty into the duodenum. This is one of our satiety hormones, so we feel nice and satiated and full and happy and glad we had a good meal once CCK is on board. It inhibits gastric emptying, so basically that again is starting to shut off the gastric phase of digestion. And it promotes normal growth of the pancreas, just like secretin does. And like secretin enhances CCK, CCK also enhances the effects of secretin. Okay, so that takes us back to the beginning where we're looking at our objectives. So we have looked at the functions of the small intestine, the functions of the large intestine, the anatomy and histology of the large intestine and the small intestine. We did a quick summary of the phases of digestion, and we looked at the hormones that control digestion. Not listed on the objectives, we did along the way go over all of those enzymes, the brush border enzymes, the pancreatic enzymes, the enzymes of the mouth and of the stomach. So that gives us a beautiful big overview of the GI tract and of the digestive system in general. So next week, midterm. And then the following 2 weeks, we're looking at metabolism and conditions of the GI tract. Okay, so I hope this was enlightening and enjoyable, and I will see you in class next week.